Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Nicole, and on behalf of Evolven and Sirius Computer Solutions, I'm excited to welcome you all to today's session on how to track change in your cloud environments and why you should care about it. So first off, again, I'd love to invite everyone to introduce yourselves via the chat box so we can all get to know each other and know who we're talking to today. Just type in your name, title, company, and where you're calling in from. So kicking off today's discussion will be Sean Kaminsky, Global Cloud Architect at Sirius Computer Solutions. Yes, wait for the crowd, Sean.
Yeah.
There you go. Then following Sean, we're going to continue the discussion with Mike Sanders, VP of Customer Success at Evolven. There we go. So first, just a few housekeeping items. Our goal today is really to have more of a discussion-led webinar, less of the standard, boring, staring at your screen webinar that you're going to hop off of midway through. So with that in mind, I'd love to encourage everyone, if you have any questions during the session, just go ahead, hop off mute to ask or type your questions into the chat box at any time, and we'll make sure that your questions are addressed. When you're not speaking, though, of course, please go back on mute so we can avoid any awkward background noises from coming through. And so during today's session, we have sprinkled in a few poll questions for you all. We would just like to kind of exchange some insights together and your 2021 plans with your peers here on this call. So to encourage everyone to share, we're going to actually make this a fun raffle. Everyone who participates in all three poll questions, you'll be entered into the raffle to win a pair of the new Apple AirPod Pro. We all know and love. I'm actually modeling them today. It could be a great holiday for yourself or your loved ones. So before we get into the good stuff with Sean and Mike, let's kick it off with one of these poll questions. And again, you can just type your answer into the chat box. So first question, kick things off. What percentage of your workload currently sits in the cloud? You can just type in A, B, or C, 0 to 50%, 50 to 75%, or 75% to 100%. Seeing a couple A coming through, 0 to 50%, a lot of A's. Couple B's.
No C's yet. Wow. Shocking. No, just kidding.
Okay, but I would say majority A, 0 to 50%. Okay, cool. All right, well, let's get started with today's discussion. Thanks for everyone participating from this first poll. Mike, why don't you give us a brief intro, and then we'll turn it over to Sean.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. So really what I want to do is just give you a real quick overview of Evolven, what we're doing, and kind of how we do things very, very quickly, and then we'll kind of get into this. So Evolven basically looks at it from this perspective. We monitor change. We look for things that are changing, whether that's in your legacy data center or all the way through to your greenfield layer, which we'll be talking a lot more today around the cloud. But the idea basically is we look at actual changes, not plan changes, not projects, not deployment processes, but really the actual changes. And what we do is we look at it at a very granular level. So I always kind of give this example when people ask me, well, how deep can you go? I can actually tell you that on line 29, somebody changed a word on a stored procedure that was deployed. So as simple as we can get down from the OS to the hardware of a machine, to the application layer, database layer, and then of course, we're going to really be talking more about the cloud services and things from that perspective. Now we do this in a very near real time. Out of the box, it's once every hour, but you do have the ability to configure this. So the last question we usually get asked before we actually start getting into some of the fun details is, well, how do you do this? Well, in the legacy world, we do this with an agent. But as we are moving more toward the brownfield and the greenfield, we're doing more an agentless approach, using APIs or sys accounts to be able to grab that data. So this is kind of what Evolven is. We're about detecting and knowing all the actual changes, not planned or expected, but what actually did change. And so I'm going to real quick just pause before I pass this over to Sean. Are there any questions about how or what we're doing around change detection? Okay, if you do have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand, get them to Nicole. She'll interrupt us along the way. We want this to be very interactive. And on that note, I'm going to pass this over to Sean. He's going to kind of talk from the Sirius side, and then I'll come back and we'll talk about how we're going to overlay what Sean and they are seeing in the cloud world. Sean?
Yeah, hey, thanks, Mike. So a few of the things we wanted to talk about and kind of kick things off are some of the benefits of native cloud and agile. And I know many of you on the call have heard most of this. And this is the reason why we really started needing to focus on change, right? So some of the key things: a faster pace of change. When customers start to embrace the native cloud and become more agile and embrace the agile methodologies, instead of waiting for like monthly or quarterly application updates or these big changes to their large monolithic applications, when you start to embrace agile methodologies, you begin to deploy these changes on a much faster pace. We have customers that are making changes every day to their applications. And the way they do that is through a higher volume of changes, but they're lots of smaller changes, right? Where we're making minor updates to the application. These things happen seamlessly, but it also makes them a little bit difficult to track, right? So that's one of the reasons that we started working with Evolven. Talking about reliable deployments, the elastic nature of the cloud helps with reliability, right? You're able to use automation and embrace application and infrastructure as code to help you increase your scalability and resilience at a higher level than you typically can in an on-premise environment. We've got greater scalability and resilience. We've got faster mean time to recoveries. And talking a little bit about the mean time to recovery, if you start embracing ephemeral instances and auto scaling and elasticity in your cloud, you can use automation to detect when you've got an issue with an instance or a container, and the system can kind of self-heal and actually reduce your mean time to recovery significantly and can actually automate those for you. Ownership, clear ownership. So when you're deploying applications and services in the cloud, there's multiple ways to identify who owns which application. One of the things we work to do is to remove our support silos in the cloud, and that helps us to understand which teams or business units own which specific applications, their instances, and making sure that we own and that we have a clear idea of support channels and all of that stuff to really help us through our entire support channel. Consistency. We use automation as much as possible when we're deploying services, instances, and everything to the cloud. And what that gives us is that very consistent, predictable deployment. We know what it's going to look like every time. It follows our standards, and our governance is already there and built into our deployments. And then lastly, one of the big benefits of doing agile and automation and infrastructure as code is it reduces fat fingers, right? I'm not manually making changes to all of these servers. I'm deploying some cloud formation that sets up the entire environment, and it really helps reduce that, oops, I didn't mean to set it like that. I meant to do it this way. Next slide, please. All right, so challenges of the native cloud. So we talked just now about some of the benefits of cloud, and along with that brings up some challenges, right? So automation's a great thing. You get those consistent deployments. We've got easy updates. We can, roll updates kind of seamlessly behind the scenes. But behind that automation, there's lots and lots of lines of code and scripts that people have developed. And in a perfect world, all of that works the way it's supposed to, and there's really no issues. But then occasionally an issue is detected with a server for some reason. The system normally in a perfect world, it self-heals, spins up a new instance and tears down the offending instance, right? but you don't really know what all's happening behind the scenes. And it's sometimes hidden a little bit what those changes, how those changes are actually affecting your environment. And so you kind of end up in a change black box. You know things are happening, but you don't really know everything that's going on there. Doing everything as code kind of makes things a little bit challenging to the staff that's actually supporting the environment. They have to sometimes dig through all of that code to look and see all of the things that are changing. And then they have to provide relevant change information for an audit. And yeah, everything is logged in AWS or Azure or whatever public cloud it is that you're using. But when everything is developed as code and just writing logs, you've got to dig through all of those logs to determine what changes happened in your environment. I don't know about you guys, but I hate digging through log files. It's just monotonous, mind-numbing work that nobody really wants to do. So the next one, incident recovery. Having all of this automation, incident recovery times are greatly reduced, right? We've got automation that automatically takes care of a lot of that. But understanding what the problem was that caused the recovery can take a lot more time. Again, there's a lot of log data you've got to go through. You've got to try to determine what changed, what caused that recovery, that automated recovery to happen. And then are you able to reproduce that environment prior to the self-healing event? Without really knowing what changed or what the state of the environment looked like prior to the healing event or the change, it's difficult to reproduce that environment so that you can diagnose and maybe prevent that from happening again. Transitioning to a shared responsibility model, that's part of cloud. I'm sure everybody has seen the AWS shared responsibility model. I'm not going to torture you and show that slide. I think you probably see it on every presentation that is discussed with AWS. But what it really does, and it is an important message to understand, and it clearly identifies what AWS is responsible for and what you as the customer are responsible for. Now, internally within your support teams, how do you deal with that shared responsibility model? You still have a dedicated server team that just deals with the EC2 side of things? Do you have a separate database team, a network team, and multiple app teams to help continue to support your environment? Some companies are actually starting to kind of bring down those walls and those silos and have more of a cloud team that is responsible for multiple facets of their environment. Now, there's still some challenge with that. You've still got to understand, all of the cloud stuff that's going on in your environment, but you also have to understand the applications that the teams are using, how those are supported, and then you need the capability of understanding what change is happening to those applications, because ultimately the cloud team is responsible for the health and the well-being of the cloud. Now, microservices are the next, I guess, great thing that has started to come to cloud, but it can also introduce some challenges as well. Decomposing services down to the smallest level and having each of those run separately is a great benefit to agility, but at times it can lead to a lot of interdependencies, right? Where all of the microservices depend on one or two critical services for this application. And if there's a problem with one of those, it can really severely impact your application. And because those are not processes that we're really familiar with, a lot of people see those as a black box, right? You don't understand how to capture all of those changes, and that's another one of those things that Evolven can help with. So which of these has been your biggest challenge so far? Are these things kind of ringing some bells with you as far as you guys have ran into some of those? Just a little bit of thought there.
And John, before you, this next slide, we actually want to make sure we got a question in the chat box from Deepak. How can we differentiate change category, standard, non-standard, in cloud from a typical or traditional ITIL framework? And how is going to record them? Do we still need a change advisory board style of working in the cloud?
So I think that's like a perfect lead in into this slide, actually. So yeah, I mean, I don't think you could have timed that question any better. So really, if we look at ITIL and CAB boards, right, traditional ITIL-based change management processes, you've got a change control board that meets once a week or once every 2 weeks in some organizations, and you've got to have your change control submitted by Tuesday before the board meets on Thursday, or it's got to be an emergency change. You got all these processes that go along with the standard CAB and ITIL processes that are, you know, enforced by your change management team, right? Those obviously you can kind of throw those out. A lot of that does not work well. It doesn't lend itself well to the elastic nature of cloud. But you still need the ability to track those changes in your ITSM. So that's one of the key things that we were struggling with a little bit, is how do we get those changes tracked in our environment, entered into our ServiceNow, so that we've got one source of truth for everything that is happening within our chain, within our cloud environment, right? So we'd still have changes that are that we can follow normal change processes with, right? If we're doing some, maybe a brand new deployment of something, spinning up a brand new environment for somebody, we will go ahead and follow normal change processes. That is a pretty significant change. It's planned. It's something that we can plan when we're going to do it. And we've got more control over that. But dealing with that change process and how slow it moves doesn't lend itself well to code updates, pipeline updates through CI/CD, you know, pipelines where you're pushing minor updates to your applications. So in many cases, you've got to work with your change boards to determine a happy medium of what do we want to continue to manage through traditional change processes, and what do we want to maybe consider using a tool like Evolven for, which is great and it can integrate with your ServiceNow. And we can use Evolven to say, hey, we've captured these changes. We want these, we want to integrate this with ServiceNow. We want to put those changes in ServiceNow so that we can at least see the changes happening in ServiceNow. So that kind of addresses some of those key challenges that you've got with traditional change management. It's thrown on its ear, really, from a cloud perspective. And a lot of those teams have not fully embraced how to deal with, you know, the control that they want to have on the environment versus the speed of change in the cloud. So how did we get here? We have needed, just like many of you guys, a way to deal with automated change control so that we can be more successful in the cloud. We needed the ability to balance speed and control. Of course, the last thing that you want to do in a cloud environment is really slow things down, right? Part of the beauty of everything is how quickly we can make things happen in the cloud. But you also need to have your controls in place around that, and you need to be able to make sure that you're tracking change appropriately. So you need that change awareness, and AWS has got their services, and yes, everything's logged, but it's not an ideal situation that we found. And you can create a lot of tooling and stuff to that to be able to do some of those integrations. But it's more of a one-off, and you've got to do a lot of analysis to understand what everything is changing, how changes are being processed, and then maybe write some customizations to do things. But the key takeaway here is that you need the ability to balance speed and control in your environment. And so what we started looking at was a way to automate this control for our environments. We wanted automated detection of changes, and not just things that we knew about, but things that we might not know changed, right? We wanted end-to-end coverage of our cloud environments. So basically, I want to set it up, point it at my AWS account, and know that everything in my environment, I'm going to get a report that says these things have changed. And I want to be able to trace changes across the life cycle. I want to be able to look and see that, oh, all right, I've got these two servers. these are my prod servers. Both of these servers should be the same. If they get out of sync, I want to know about it. I want to know what's changing from dev to stage to prod, right? I want to have that traceability. And another thing, ideally, we want to be able to use change information to be able to help us reduce our recovery times and to help with root cause analysis and to help with remediation. And so those were some of our key goals of how we needed to address change in our cloud practice. So a couple of the things that we ran into recently, and I wanted to throw out a couple of examples before I finish up my piece of this. And let me pause a second before I get into this. Does anybody have any questions or comments? I see another question. How are conflicts avoided to ensure there's no impact to production if change is not reviewed at CAP? So that's an agile methodology, right? And a lot of that depends, right, on the scope of the changes that are happening. Many times application changes are very minor that happen, right? We're making minor changes to a web page or minor changes to this application. It's very similar to most of the apps that you have on your phone, right? Those things change frequently. You never really know that there's a change happening on the back end. And the changes may be very small, very subtle, but they're rolling these improvements out all the time. And so you still have to weigh the risk of those changes, but you always have feedback loops and gates in any of those changes that are happening in a CI/CD platform, right? If you're pushing things through a pipeline, there should be gates and validations at every step of that change as it's moving through your life cycle to validate that you don't have conflicts with a specific component of the application, and that your security is enforced across the stack. And so your platform and your pipeline should support ensuring that you don't have, that you're minimizing your impact to production and preventing any conflicts or anything like that. So Kathy, I hope that kind of answered your question.
Yeah, and Sean, also, just to let you know, I will actually give a real quick example of that during the demo, where there were actually two changes, and it looked like it was one change that caused the major issue, but it actually ended up being two changes that went in almost simultaneous that really caused the ultimate performance issue. So we'll actually address that during the demo. Okay,
all right, great, thanks. So real quick, I wanted to talk about a couple of problems we've seen and some examples that I've personally used Evolven for in our environment. So recently a customer was making some deployments through their CI/CD pipeline and it kept failing. And I couldn't really understand what was going on, why it was failing. They got an error message, but they came to us with some asking for help, right? Trying to understand what's happening. Real quick, go into the Evolven console. It says, look, this is what's happened. We could see that, hey, the environment scaled from 1 to 2. So this was a dev instance. It wasn't production, so they were fine running typically with one instance. But their process that they were running, the first thing that it did was it scaled the instances from 1 instance to 2 instances. Well, the challenge that they were hitting was that the autoscaler was set to a maximum of 2 instances. So when the next step of their process was to try to spin up another instance, they would get an error because the autoscaler was like, hey, I don't have any headroom. Max is 2, you're already at 2, we can't do anything. And it would fail. So we were able to quickly, through the Evolven product, we were able to show them exactly what's going on. And they were able to correct the things in their pipeline and get that rolling the way that they needed to. Now, another one that we ran into, which is actually a production issue, and it was pretty significant. The customer was reporting errors in their web application for some users. It wasn't completely down. They were getting some users that were hitting the website. But eventually users were starting to receive errors. And what we did, we again went to the Evolven console, checked that environment, and we were able to see that a change had happened recently to their Nginx configuration, and it modified the max connections parameter. So instead of being 0, which is an unlimited amount, it had gotten changed to 50. So what was happening is they were fine for a while up until they got to 50 users on their environment. And the moment that that server hit 50, it started erroring out and the users were getting errors and they didn't really know why. So again, we provided that information to the customer and they're like, oh yeah, we'll go put that back. They changed the value back and they were able to very quickly resolve their issue without having to spend a lot of time in diagnosis. We found the issue very quickly with Evolven, and it was really key to that quick recovery.
Hey, Sean.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Very.
Hey, Tyler. Did you have a question, Tyler?
Yeah, I just got a quick self-serving question. So from a managed services perspective, is Evolven embedded as a standard tool in our suite that we would bring to manage our clients' environments, meaning sort of a fringe benefit, just like we would bring Science Logic or something else?
Yeah, for our cloud managed services, we do have this as our product that is managing their environments.
Okay, good to know. Thanks.
Uh-huh.
Any other questions? Oh, sorry, I can do that. From anybody? I saw Peter, you had a hand raised. Did you have a question?
No, sorry about that. That was one of those fat fingers.
No problem. All right. Well, awesome. I see we have some people answering in the chat box for our second poll question. What are your cloud adoption plans for 2021? I'm seeing a lot of A's, which is increase cloud adoption, B, decrease cloud adoption, or C, remain the same. Awesome. I'm seeing all A's.
As we figured. I like that one. Easy. A.
CA. Awesome. All right. Well, I'll let you guys keep answering that poll. Thanks for participating. And next, we'll let you take it away, Mike, and share with us some more strategies for maintaining change control in the cloud.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole, and thanks, Sean. So let's now build upon what Sean talked about, right? We'll come back to this image here around speed and control, right? So basically, we understand as we are moving more, and we're moving very rapidly into this digital transformation over the last 18 months. Things are speeding up. And the problem is when we start to violate this speed versus control, we're getting a result of something that's going on. And that is the stability, security, and compliance starts becoming compromised. Now, every year we hear about outages that are happening or incidents that are happening, and everybody wants to stay out of the news, right? But the problem is we're seeing this due to changes, right? There's incidents that are happening. Mean time to resolution is difficult. Why was somebody out for 18 hours? It's because of the change that they lost control of what was changing in their environment. And basically, if you think about it, Gartner talks about things like this. 85% of our incidents can be traced to changes. I think there's a study out there that Forrester talks about, hey, nearly all security attacks are a result of a change. Think about that, right? Somebody comes in and just makes a minor change to be able to get into your environment so they can start to do security hacks. And the key here is basically one great example is NERC fined Duke Energy one of the largest penalties because they lost control of their changes. Think about it, right? They could no longer tell what was changing and what was going on in their environment. So why is this happening? If we go to the next slide, we'll talk about why is it that we've lost this speed versus control? Well, traditionally what it is, it's due to the fact that IT is flying blind. Right? And what I mean by that is it's very difficult for us to actually know what's changing. Now, when we talk about a change, we're not talking about what Sean was talking about earlier about, the process of planning it or the process of going into your CI/CD and your pipeline or your projects. Evolven is giving you the actual changes. That means if it's something that was planned or known about, or even something that was undocumented or unauthorized. And Sean's talked about some examples that they've run into with the AWS, but you can see our 4 boxes here. These are things that we've seen from our customers, whether it's a DBA issue or it's a change in a microservice or I can give an example just recently where somebody accidentally made a configuration into an IAM policy, and it actually was potentially going to expose some security violations or vulnerabilities. And that's the key here. That customer actually said, we would have had no clue that that minor change was made, and it was an accident. It wasn't on purpose. It wasn't intentional. Somebody accidentally just clicked a box that they didn't realize they clicked. So if we take a look at then how are we doing this, or what are the pillars around what Evolven would do? So if you go to the next slide, Nicole, we can talk about the reasons or how we do these, right? So basically, if we think about it, what Evolven is doing is, first off, we know about all the actual changes. Now, my very first slide was about how we look at this through the legacy all the way through. And that's one of the key things is Evolven has the ability, not only in the cloud world, which we're talking about today, but you have the ability to look at it from the legacy side. So why is that really important? Well, it's really important because as you start to do that transition, we're actually able to monitor that through your legacy into your brownfield, into your greenfield. Now, one of the key things here is our correlation. So not only is it that we start with the fact that Evolven knows about all the changes, but how do we actually start to utilize other tools? Now, I'm going to show you in my demo how I'm actually going to use an AWS tool to solve a problem very quickly. But whether we're in your CI/CD pipeline, whether we're in your incident management, whether we're in your traditional ITSM world, Evolven is the core in the middle. And that basically says that since we know what changes, we can bring all of these other data points in, and we can give you relevant information. And I'll give you an example. In the APM world, when we start having a problem, we see symptoms. That's great, but what's the root cause? Evolven would overlay to that symptom to give you a root cause, and we'll show that during the demo. And then one of the big things that we always get asked is, hey, Mike, there's been a lot of companies who've tried this, but how do you guys get rid of the noise, right? That noise is very difficult, right? Change happens. We know that. We're not saying don't change. We're saying how do you manage it and control it with your visibility? And the ability is that Evolven has multiple patents around our analytics. And our analytics start with simply this. We want to get the noise reduction, things that we don't care about. I always call it relevance. What is relevant to me that I care about? And our analytics and our UI has the ability to take you from a lot of changes and to continue to narrow it down to what's really important. And one of the key things I always talk about is how do I overlay with that correlation data to get down to those 3 dots that I really care about? So if we take a look at it, how are our customers actually doing this? What are our customers doing out there that basically is helping them change or lower things that they're running into? So let's talk about 3 big use cases that I talked about when we lose speed and control, right? Stability, compliance, and security. All right, stability. Basically, if you think about it, our customers are trying to reduce the number of issues, right? And they're trying to reduce their mean time to resolution. Now, one of the big problems here is mean time to identification. Now, I'm going to talk about that here in a second, but let's just talk about proactive approach. So from the moment that we actually deploy something, we actually have a little time lag in which we can actually look at our highest risk or the changes that happen in our environment. Now, what I mean by that is, look, we may have known about some risky changes we were making, but maybe some of the things that we deployed, we didn't think were going to have a high risk score. And maybe we detected a value anomaly, something that's not normal in our environment. We have time usually to prevent that issue. But unfortunately, sometimes issues still will happen. So what happens then? I already talked about it. If we have the investigative parameters, we can actually overlay our change analytics to get to its root cause. And what I mean by that is I don't want to look at 100 changes. I want to look at the 5 that has the highest probability that caused the change. Now, I can still go look at the other 95, and we'll show that. But the reality of it is any engineer, we want to start with the highest probability. Now, one of the other things that we see in stability is around drift. And this is around business continuity, things like that. So one of the things that we see is customers come to us right off the bat very early and say, hey, we get all of this stability around changes, but we have an issue right now that when we switch over to our DR, we have issues. And we just don't know what's different. We think it's a database, but we have no clue. So Evolven has the ability to immediately upon deployment, go and look at your DR versus your prod and maybe take your databases and go, oh, we can see that you have some index or some table differences between your prod and your DR. All right, so let's move to the compliance. Nope, let's stay there real quick. Let's talk about compliance. So compliance basically also, we're looking at, Sean talked about how the frameworks just don't quite play really well with where we're headed in our digital transformation. Now, many of our customers have already passed internal and external audits using Evolven because the auditors say, I understand what you planned, but what did you actually do? And when you get to that world, that's whenever they start to get a lot more comfortable because they can show what they actually did. But here's what's really interesting. The faster we move, the faster we're going to be going, we're going to have probably less planning. That doesn't mean the auditors are going to ask that any less of that question. They're still going to want to know, what did you change with these 10 releases? Please explain to me exactly what you did. Even if you have it documented, I need to know what you did. And then the last part is security. Now, SecOps has really become really prevalent around change in the last 18 months. In fact, we talk with them more and more these days because they're very concerned about change. As I talked earlier, one of the key things, the way people try to get breaches is just making a minor change, something very small that they can get in and do a malicious activity on your environment. By giving and exposing all those changes, what that really does is that allows those SecOps teams to be able to say, I know what's changed. So if you're trying to change a connection string on me, I can see that and I can step in very early. Now, these are the big three, but that's not all of the use cases. We have use cases around inventory analytics, and that's kind of a security compliance, right? Are all of my updates completed out there? Maybe we want to do something like CMDB enrichment. Yes, we have bidirectional into CMDB to where we can update your CMDBs. And then, you know, I already talked about data center consolidation and cloud migration, right? These are critical things that we're looking at for use cases. So before we move on and I start to actually show the demo, any questions around our use cases? Any thoughts or ideas? I'm going to take a little breather to get some tea. So if not, let's go ahead and Nicole, do you want to pass the share to me? And I will, let me know when you can see my AWS demo screen.
Yep, we can see it.
All right, cool. So real quick demo, because we really do want to leave this enough time to kind of talk about, you know, questions and answers at the end. But really what I want to do is I want to just kind of give you a real quick understanding of three things. One, what are we collecting and how do we see those changes? How can we use the UI, Mike, as you were talking about, how do I get to something that I care about? And then ultimately I want to solve a real quick problem. So this is just kind of an overview, an example of a dashboard that you could have up and running. Now this dashboard has both a cloud where my changes are landing. This is very critical to me because I'd like to know where are changes happening so I can click into this and take a look at what types of changes. And I'll do that here in a second. But along the lines, as we're moving into that digital transformation, right, we already talked about it. The CI/CD pipeline and the DevOps processes are very critical. So what does that mean, Mike? How are you playing there? Well, if you can see, we have a couple little red gates there. Those are exactly that. It's a gate. Now, what can that gate mean? Well, there's a couple examples. One is you've already set a requirement, and we'll kind of drop down here real quick and talk about policies, but you've already set a requirement or a policy, meaning that for us to roll out this next release of XYZ application service, we have to have a memory set to a certain level. Okay, well, as we're rolling along, all of a sudden we get to the UAT and we realize that environment is set up incorrectly. So don't start your UAT testing because you may actually waste time and money. Make certain that your environment is up to speed, ready for you to push that new release so you can do your UAT testing. On the same thing is let's talk about what if we actually went into production. and all of a sudden we detected a value anomaly, like you did something that you didn't think you were going to do. We could actually flag that very early, throw it back into your DevOps process and say, hey, red flag, you guys just rolled out something that you said you weren't going to do, or that rollout actually caused the value like an anomaly. So something maybe going from a number to a text is a great example. All right, so let's actually take a look a little bit here. I'm going to go ahead and click into some changes that's actually happened on our AWS instance. So what it's doing now is it's pulling up those changes, and I'm just going to show you a couple examples. But what I really would like to do is I'd like to be able to show you just kind of a little bit of a what I call a housekeeping. But as I always said, is I've got a lot of areas over here where I actually have things that are actually, where did my changes land, right? So if I want to take a look very quickly in my cloud services, I know what type of changes happened. Now, if you look over on our right-hand side, this is also something that we have part of one of our patents. It's our ability to put the changes into like-type communities or basically buckets. And what I mean by that is we have tons and tons of categories out of the box that you can select and you can sort these changes. Now, these are two that we usually start with, artifacts and impact area. Well, and I'm going to use the impact area a little bit later in solving a problem. Now, a couple of things I want to show you very quickly in the UI, right? The very first thing that we do is we expose the actual parameter and the setting, and also we start to give you something that I want to talk about very quickly, and that is around a value history. So what is a value history? A value history is nothing more than our ability to track that parameter through its life cycle of changes. And what I mean by that is we don't destroy that data. That data is always there. It's very important for auditing, compliance, but also for troubleshooting, right? So for example, if I want to go and take a look at this setting and this value history of this S3 parameter, I can just click on the value history and I can see the exact date it was changed from false to true. This is very critical because an auditor may say, did this ever change? Yep. When did you detect it? Detected it on the 8th. Now, if I set this back to false, how fast did it take you to remediate it? All of this data is controlled and maintained within Evolven, so you can actually answer these questions. Now, the other big thing I like to talk about over here is things around my impact area. Now, impact area are the things, it's our knowledge-based and machine learning that actually says these types of changes can cause these issues. Now, we never say they do. We just say they could. Now, why is that really important? Well, let's say I actually wanted to come in here and click on a security parameter. I can actually come in here and see that what's changed around a potential security issue. You can see one of our categories is cost. Cost is basically meaning that maybe we increased our CPU too high, and it could potentially cause us a cost issue long term. And then I'm going to talk about performance here in a minute, about how I can use that to actually start to look at some other types of things. But here's just some examples of the changes that we're talking about, whether it's auto scaling or S3 buckets. And again, you always have the ability just to click in here and to see what was it before, what is it now, and it gives you a great troubleshooting mechanism to say, hey, you guys decreased this from 70 to 50, could this be the issue? And I'm pretty certain that's probably what Sean used whenever they were dealing with that max connections. They could see that they went from 0, unlimited, to that 50. And if they set that back to a 0 or to a higher number and they see that problem go away, then they have that track of how they were able to remediate it. All right. So that's just kind of looking around. These are the types of changes. And by the way, this is just a really high level of what we have. I'll just come back to my cloud picture. We're monitoring things like IAM and RDS and transit gateway and API gateway type stuff. All of this is included along with the traditional information around Linux or Windows OS's traditional application. All that is still combined. It's just, think of it this way: as we go from the brownfield to the greenfield, Evolven has the ability to track all of that. All right, so showing you around, let's talk about how now I can bring in some symptomatic data and actually solve an issue that is happening. We weren't able to prevent it, but something is now happening. So let's take a look. If you see down here, you can see where we're actually using CloudWatch alerts. So something has happened. We have a performance degradation, or in this case, we have some services that aren't available. So what's going on? So by clicking into this alert, what's going to happen now is we're using those symptomatic data and we're actually overlaying our change analytics to give you a highest probability. So Evolven's doing the thinking right now. All right, so let's talk about what happened. We actually said there are 2 changes that we think have the highest priority that we want you to look at first. Now, again, I'm not saying it's the actual issue, but as an engineer, I want a starting point. Immediately, yep, that's the one that worries me. So I'm going to use value history again to understand what happened. By clicking here, I can see we went from 1024 to 128. Now, as an engineer, I don't know what we did. Did we mean to do that? Did we mean to decrease that memory that low? We thought we were over instrumented or something. I don't know. Did somebody mean to type 1280? I really don't know at this point. But what's really cool is we also are tied to the deployment process. I actually see the deployment number that actually pushed this. So if you do have good documentation, I can go back and read it and see that we were actually trying to increase the memory and we did a fat finger. I know fat fingers are supposed to be eliminated, but we still make mistakes. Things will still happen. Even with automation, we build a wrong artifact. We accidentally forgot to type the 0. We hit push. We got really busy. Things like that happen. Now, what if we make that change and it didn't quite 100% bring us back to the level that we thought we should be at? Like we had a better performance before all this happened. And then this is that question where, what if we have 2 changes that clash? Or what if we have 2 changes that caused an issue that we didn't realize? Or maybe we did something that we didn't plan well enough for. So I'm going to actually now just go and ask for all 57 changes. But now I'm going to actually say, are there any changes that I haven't looked at that were high risk that also could be causing that? So I'm just going to go ahead and click on my performance bucket. By clicking on that, immediately what jumps out at me is, oh, looky there. We actually also executed right about the same time a new service called credit card loans. So in this case, what happened truly happened was we had a memory change and a new service, and that really brought down all of our services. But even though it wasn't scored as a high risk because we didn't think just rolling out a new service was going to be that of a high risk change, I still have the visibility into all actual changes. And as an engineer, I can look at this and go, you know what's probably happened is it's probably a combination of 1 and 3. So maybe we need to go and increase our memory a little bit more. But if we do get to that point to where we get to the right service levels, then we know that we've actually got our systems running correctly. So with that, I'm going to kind of pause. I really do want to kind of open this up for questions. At this point, we have about 10 minutes left. Any thoughts, ideas, or concerns before we open it up? We'll pass it back to you, Nicole, for Q&A. I know you wanted to have some open discussion at the very end.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Yeah, as you said, as we reach to the top of the hour, we can just open up some final question and answer for either you or Sean. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or just type your questions in the chat box now.
We'll get them going here in a minute.
I was like, you guys must have covered a lot.
So are there any questions around, you know, like how, you know, what services we cover or anything like that? One of the key things that, you know, Sean and I have worked quite a bit on is, you know, AWS is constantly changing. So we have a great partnership with Sirius, and where we actually, they can see something coming down pipeline that's saying, hey, here's some new services that we're going to be deploying. So we try to get ahead of that to be able to have that visibility. So that's one of the things that we really do love with our partnership with Sirius is we're all trying to look forward to see what's coming, and then that way Evolven can be ready for it whenever we start rolling it out. So that's one thing I did not hit, and it's really nice to be able to have this partnership. I see we do have some questions.
Yeah, we have a question from Deepak. How does Evolven UI pick up changes? Basically from where? Like ServiceNow, syslog, cloud log?
Yeah, good question. So let's talk about the actual changes real quick. So actual changes, Evolven does it in two ways, right? You have an agent. It's agent-based that we're looking at more of our legacy stuff. And then when we're looking at the cloud world and the cloud services, network devices, things like data power, we traditionally use an API, and that's how we do it. So it's an agentless approach. Now, when we look at the things like change records and deployment projects, yes, we have a bidirectional integration into these types of tools where we can go out there and read the data and create what we call a manifest. That manifest is basically us reading that change record, understanding exactly what you planned on changing, and then that way we can overlay our changes to get that correlation.
Great. One more question. What type of changes does Evolven monitor? Can you give some examples for us?
If I was a sales rep, and I'm not meaning to pick on them right now, that would be all of the changes. But the answer is yes, all. But now that doesn't mean that we look at all changes, right? We eliminate changes, dynamic changes, log files, things like that. We don't look at those. We really look at what's relevant. But if you take a look at the stack, we go all the way from the hardware all the way up through the application layer, and including things like Lambda services, containers, of course, the AWS services that we've been showing here. Really, our goal is to look at it from the core, the very bottom infrastructure, all the way through the highest level of the application layer.
Great. Any other questions from the audience? All right. Well, then before we wrap it up, I have one more poll question for everybody. Again, just type your answer into the chat box, and everyone who's participating in all the poll questions, you're going to be in the raffle to win Apple AirPods. So the question is, the increased dynamics and constant changes in the cloud combined with the increased speeds from the adoption of DevOps and Agile has created increased pressure on control. Do you agree, disagree, or still undecided?
Deepak answered right away. You aren't even done yet.
That's good. All right, lots of A's again. A, absolutely. Love it, John.
I agree with that last comment. It is getting complex every day.
Mm-hmm. All right. Great. Well, I think that's about wraps it up for us today. So thank you again to Sean and Mike for leading today's discussion. We're still here, for the last few minutes, and we'd love to answer any questions and continue discussions this week. If you're interested in a one-on-one customized demo, definitely email any of us directly. We'll be sending a follow-up email as well, so just reply there too to schedule any follow-up discussions. So thank you all again for attending, and hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.